That was Third Day with I Believe. You're on 94.9. It's 14 minutes past 4. And that means it's time for Creation Ministries International. And if you do have any questions, we'd love you to send them through. It's our second week with Dr. Mark Harwood from Creation Ministries. And our SMS line or our text line is 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. Mark, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mick. Good to be back on the program again.
It's awesome to have you back on again. And, of course, last week we talked a lot about the Bible and why you can actually have faith in the Bible and why its words are correct.
Absolutely. In fact, I gave 5 basic reasons, there are more than that, but 5 key ones, that we can give us great confidence that the Bible truly is the correct holy book and it's been inspired by God. And those 5 were, it contains perfectly fulfilled prophecy, and of course people can't foresee the future, only God can do that. The second one was there is an amazing consistency with the Bible's record of history and what we can observe in the world around us today. And we spent a bit of time talking about some of those. The third one was there's an incredibly unified thread of meaning that runs through the whole of the Bible from the beginning to the end. But it's written by some 40 or more authors over about 1,600 years. So those authors could not have corroborated together to structure that up. It must have come from a divine author. The fact that the Bible doesn't contain any errors, and yet the people who wrote the words, the human beings, would have had all kinds of crazy ideas perhaps about the physical world, but the Holy Spirit so guided what they wrote that they didn't include any errors in the text. And the fifth reason was the extraordinary transforming power that the Bible has. People who have just had incredible transformations in their lives have gone from the very pits to the very pinnacles, I think. So they're the 5 sort of key reasons, but there are others, as I mentioned. And last week we talked a bit about how the Bible's record of history, the fact that creation was only about 6,000 years ago and so on, is consistent with the observations that we can make in the world around us.
Yep.
And you might remember, Mick, we talked about comets, short-period comets, and how come they shouldn't be there, and that there's no secular explanation for where short periods can come from.
Yep.
But there's a heap more that I'd love to talk about with you today.
Uh-huh.
So, shall we get underway?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, a couple that really stand out. Everybody knows about the spectacular rings of the planet Saturn. It just makes it such an amazing sight. And if you've looked through a telescope at Saturn and seen the rings, it's just absolutely extraordinary. So many people are just gobsmacked when they look at it. But Saturn's rings are disintegrating very, very rapidly. There was a spacecraft called Cassini that orbited Saturn for some 13 years, and they finally deliberately crashed it into the planet back in 2017, I think it was. So it was very close. It got really good look at the rings, actually flew through the rings a few times. And they figured out from the data from Cassini that the rings are raining back down onto the surface of the planet at an extraordinary rate. So fast, in fact, that the rings could not be more than just a few 100 million years old, nowhere near as long as the claimed age of the solar system, which is about 4.5 billion years old, or 4,500 million, if you will. So how come these rings are still here? So the scientists have a bit of a dilemma, you see, that they think that mankind just evolved in the last 100,000 years or so. So here we are, just at this moment in all of the Big Bang history, just when Saturn's rings have somehow or other formed and they're still here, haven't yet disintegrated. And what an amazing coincidence that we just got to see these things. And, it's like it's too much luck. And they recognise that, and they scratch their heads. How could this be? And yet it's quite consistent with the Bible's record of history, which says that the creation was only about 6,000 years ago. So to see that the rings are rapidly disappearing, but they're still here, actually points to a young age for the creation of the solar system.
What created? Where did the rings come from?
Well, in the secular scheme of things, they've actually got no idea because they're incredibly thin. They're about 300,000 kilometres across. They largely consist of chunks of water ice, ranging in size from, about a grain of sand to a large rock. They're incredibly thin. In fact, if the rings were a sheet 1 metre wide, the sheet would be a millionth of a millimetre thick.
Mm.
So they are staggeringly thin. They're absolutely extraordinary. Interestingly, the rings are going to disappear in March of next year because they will be edge-on to us. So if you look at Saturn now with a telescope, you'll see the rings as a very thin ellipse, but it's getting thinner and thinner, and then we'll see them edge-on in March, and they'll just disappear.
Mm.
And a few weeks later, you'll start to see a thin line again, and then you'll see them fatten up. This happened last in about 2009.
Okay, yeah.
So the secularists have got no idea how the rings could have formed. There are all kinds of theories. People think that maybe there were collisions of some of Saturn's moons, but the trouble is the orbits of the chunks of rock and so on and ice in the rings doesn't fit that kind of scenario. You wouldn't expect to see such incredibly neat circular orbits and in such a fine and very, very thin plane. You'd expect a lot more scatter, in other words, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
But I think God made Saturn that way and created those rings to declare his glory.
Yep.
Because they're absolutely amazing, and if people see them through a telescope, it's quite breathtaking.
Yeah, well, there's quite a few breathtaking things happening at the moment. Of course, we're seeing some pretty amazing auroras around the planet. It's been just awesome the last couple of months. And also, at the moment, there's a stack of meteors or comets flying around us.
Yes.
Yeah, there's two different shows going on. And again, that comes back to, you were talking about them running out. They're just going to keep sort of falling out of the sky and running into the sun and everything else. How do they just keep going forever? Well, of course they don't.
That's right. They don't. That's exactly right, which, of course, is another evidence that the solar system cannot be billions of years old, which is what the secularists would have us believe. You've got to remember that the guys who were trying to come up with this naturalistic version of where the universe and the solar system came from are actually trying to explain the existence of the solar system and the universe without God.
Yeah.
So in the limit, I guess, what that's basically saying is we don't believe there's a God. We have to explain it in natural terms. But for the Christian, because we know there's a creator God, we don't need any particular time. The reason we think the universe is about 6,000 years old is because that's what the Bible tells us.
Mm.
So that's why we believe it's only about that old.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's been a lot of news just in the last week that I've seen coming from different science papers and magazines where they've talked about space things that are going on, and every time they put dates on it, and every time their dates are just out there dates. Whether it's, how old these, the comets are that are flying past and meteors, or how old planets are, or how old they've been looking at some new planet somewhere that they think might have life or might have had life on it. And they keep putting ages on all of these things. And I didn't have to read long, and I would have read probably 3 or 4 different, millions of years ages just in one evening.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, where do they get those dates from?
Well, you have to have deep time, as they call it. That's the millions and millions of years, to have even a fighting chance of the naturalistic explanations for the origin of the universe to even have a chance of working. Because the universe is so complex, it can't have happened by natural processes very quickly. It must have taken a huge amount of time. So the belief in deep time really just reflects the belief that there's no God and we have to explain everything naturally. And it's very sad when you see Christians adopting the evolutionary story about origins, because we don't have to. We have a God who has given us his word, and he tells us what he did right from the beginning, and he even gives us a time scale. which we can find in the genealogies in the book of Genesis. It's amazing how God has done that, because he gives the age of the father when the son next in line is born.
Yeah.
And you can find it in Genesis 5. Adam was 130 when his son Seth was born, and Seth was 105 when Enosh was born. And you can just add all those numbers up, and you can find out that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after creation. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. Sometimes people say, but there might be missing generations. But even if there were, you can still add those numbers up, because you've got the age of the father when the son next, or grandson maybe. But I don't think it's true. I think all the generations are represented accurately in the book of Genesis.
It sometimes you sort of think when you read a paper from a non-Christian perspective, particularly some of these guys that are talking about images taken by, say, the James Webb Space Telescope. I mean, it hasn't been up there that long, and they've come up with some amazing new images. But there's a few different space telescopes up there that have been taking snaps of worlds a long way away, and all of a sudden there's news because they've got a new snapshot, and there's a date on it. It's almost like the camera has this little date machine rigged into it that somehow has numbers come up every time, and it's almost, people think that there's a machine that somehow gives them those dates, but they've sort of got these dates in their mind before they even take the photo, haven't they?
Well, they have, because that's the way our culture presents the story of our creation. They present it from the point of view that it all happened through natural processes, and that there's no God, that the Bible isn't true, and so on. And so what those ages actually represent is a belief about what happened in the past. But if you have a different belief, if you believe the Bible is true and its record of history is true, then you get a very different story. So you're quite right. Scientists can't actually measure the age, even though it does seem like they do. When they state an age, they're really reflecting their belief about its history and the process of its origin.
Yeah.
So because all the media, TV programs all repeat the hundreds of millions of years kind of story, but there's so much evidence out there which is not consistent with it. Like, for instance, the rings of Saturn. It's just they didn't happen that they can't have been around for a long time, because they're decaying very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
There's a stack of these things. There are, for instance, there are volcanoes in the solar system, and you think of that little planet Io. It's the closest planet to Jupiter, and it's a very fiery little place.
Yep.
And it's giving out enormous amount of heat energy, and scientists are perplexed by this, because they say, well, where does all this heat energy come from?
Yeah.
It was first, volcanic eruptions are first observed there by telescope back in the late 1970s. But since we've had spacecraft go close by, we've discovered that some of these volcanoes are enormous, sending plumes hundreds of kilometres above the moon's surface. In fact, it's been erupting. If it's been erupting for 4.5 billion years, at even 1/10 of its current rate, it would have erupted its entire mass 40 times over.
Oh, wow.
So it's a very violent little place, but it's quite small. It's about a quarter of the diameter of the Earth.
Yeah.
And, you can't... Well, what's the source of all the heat? It should have cooled down by now.
The energy should have been all spent. Yeah,
that's right. So
absolutely.
It can't be billions of years old. The evidence everywhere you look in the solar system points to the truth of God's word and the timeline of creation, as we find in Genesis.
Absolutely. Look, we're going to have to go into a little break right now. We are with Dr. Mark Harwood, and if you have any questions, please send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. It is 22 minutes to 5, and we have Dr. Mark Harwood on the line from Creation Ministries International. If you have any questions for Dr. Mark, please send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. Now, of course, Dr. Mark has been talking a bit about space and stuff going on up there, and sort of there's some of the theories that, I guess evolutionists have thrown into the into the mix, and some of the theories that creationists, well, I guess they're not theories, we know they're fact, that they've thrown into the mix. And Dr. Mark Harwood has spent plenty of years looking at the sky. Of course, he put Australia's first radio, it's not a telescope, I keep saying that, it's a communications device into space.
Satellite, that's right. Communications satellite.
There we go.
Yeah.
So, of course, he knows a lot about space and what's up there. Now, Dr. Mark, I've looked at a bunch of stories over the last few weeks where they've been talking about things like volcanoes and all these eruptions happening on planets. And some of the images, I've got to say, are spectacular. But I can't imagine many of them are actually real.
No, a lot of those things that you'll see are just artists' impressions to give people an idea of what it might be like. But these things are incredibly distant, particularly on planets that are orbiting other stars. So we really can't image them in that sort of a way, like a photograph. But they can detect different elements by looking at the nature of the light that comes. You can do a spectrum analysis and discover the unique signatures of different elements and different compounds, which enable scientists to get an idea of what these are like. You know, one of the things which comes out of all the studies on exoplanets, which really strikes me, is that, and they found well over 5,000 planets orbiting other stars now.
Yep.
And not one of those systems, that's planets, and you know, there'd be typically 4 or 5 or 6 maybe around each one. So you're looking at somewhere in the order of 1,000 different systems of planets, but none of them look anything like our solar system. Our solar system is amazingly special and unique. We've got this combination of terrestrial planets close in, and we've got these massive gaseous planets like Saturn and Jupiter and Uranus and Neptune that are further out. And so the astronomers thought, well, our solar system must be just like any other solar system, so we should find lots just like ours. But they haven't found one. And it's absolutely perplexing. One astronomer said in the press, you know, I think we have to have or find a completely new theory of planetary formation, because obviously our theories aren't predicting what we're observing.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's amazing. And I think, well, you know, it's probably not unrealistic, because the theories that the secular astronomers have all begin by assuming there's no God, and you have to use naturalistic explanations for everything. And, of course, when you do that, you know you're not going to get the right result, because the Bible tells us very clearly, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in particular, on the 4th day of the creation week, he created the sun, moon, stars, and everything else. So you would expect to find signatures in what God created that would point to the time scales that the Bible expresses, and they're only measured in thousands of years. And you'd expect to see evidence of design. You'd expect to see extraordinary variety, which is what our creative God is like. And we find that, of course, on the earth. And you find some really, I love some of these that are inexplicable from any other way. You know, the planet Jupiter has got stacks and stacks of moons zooming around it. I think the number they're up to now is somewhere north of 80 different moons.
Wow.
But back in July 98, some astronomers found a group of new ones, a group of 12. They were actually orbiting backwards. They're going the wrong way around Jupiter, which, by the way, plays havoc with the idea of the condensing cloud of dust and gas. And if that was true, then all the moons would orbit in exactly the same direction around the planet. But apart from that, in amongst this group of 12, there was one which was actually going the other way, the right way, if you will. And they're astonished, because that's a very unstable situation, because a head-on collision is going to occur very quickly.
Yeah.
You can't. It's like crossing the road and getting onto the wrong side of the highway. You know, how long are you going to last? Well, not too long. And they realised that the system, this new group of 12 moons, could not have been around for 4.5 billion years or even 1 million years, because, you know, high probability they would have collided and just grind them down to dust, you know.
Yes.
So it's a lovely little indicator. There's another one, the planet Uranus, has a group of 13 small moons that are quite close in. For some reason, they're named after Shakespearean characters. I don't know why. I guess they got a bit, adventurous in the astronomical circles. Maybe someone had read a Shakespearean play.
They were probably reading Othello at the time or something. Yeah.
Yeah. But these 13 moons are incredible because the radius of their orbits differs by only about 10,000 kilometres. Now, that's an extraordinary small distance, and there are 13 moons packed into this space, which means they must be orbiting at almost exactly the same speed, the same period around the planet. So they'll pass each other very, very slowly. And that means they'll be gravitationally interacting. They'll attract each other, which will disturb their orbits, which means they will collide. And yet here they are, all 13 of them. They have obviously not yet collided, but the astronomers are astonished again. They say, well, hang on, these can't have been there for 4.5 billion years. In fact, in the order of about a million years, they would have wiped themselves out.
Wow.
But there they are. So it's yet another indicator, observable science tells us this, that this was not created 4.5 billion years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not just an academic exercise here, Mick, because the millions of years that we hear about in the evolutionary story inevitably places suffering and death and misery on our planet before Adam and Eve. And if that's true, then there's absolutely no point in the last Adam coming to Earth to pay the price for the first Adam's rebellion. So the millions of years actually undercut the very gospel message itself. And that's why we think this whole issue of creation and believing what the Bible literally says at the beginning, this is God's eyewitness account of what he did at the beginning of creation. Believing that is so important because it makes sense of the gospel. That's why Jesus came, to pay the price for Adam's sin. And what was the price? It was death. If you have millions of years, death ends up before Adam. And so there's no need for Jesus to go to the cross. And it's just as serious as that.
Wow, absolutely. Now, look, I don't know if we've got time, but I often hear, the only reason we have, or I've heard from, secular circles, the only reason we have life here is because we're in the Goldilocks zone. What is a Goldilocks zone?
Oh, that's this special part of the orbit around the sun where liquid water can exist, where the planet's not too hot or too cold, where it's got just exactly the right conditions for life. And there are many, many conditions for life to be able to exist, not just liquid water being present, but that's the most fundamental. And it's called the Goldilocks zone because everything is just right, not too hot, not too cold, and so on. And guess where we are? In the Goldilocks zone. So our solar system is made as a home for mankind.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, look, I thank you so much. Again, Dr. Mark, I've got other questions, but we'll leave them for next time. I thank you for your time, and it's always brilliant having you.
It's a privilege to be on the program.